C-SPAN's Washington Journal continues.
Laura Ingraham, we'll start with you this morning. What did you find in the morning papers of interest?
Well, what are we going to do about Patrick Buchanan? I think the Republican Party and the Wall Street Journal has some interesting insights into what's going to happen in New Hampshire and what the Republicans can do about it. I think one thing that Democrats and Republicans can probably agree on this morning is that if the Republicans aren't able to bring together economic conservatives as well as social conservatives, they have little to no chance of beating President Clinton. So clearly, Patrick Buchanan's a pitch to lower class, middle class workers who are disenchanted with the notion of exporting jobs overseas and downsizing companies and so forth. He's making a huge appeal to these people and appealing to social conservatives in a way that people like Steve Forbes haven't been able to do so far. So I think that these people are really going to have to unite and stop attacking each other. Otherwise, we're going to see President Clinton in for a second term, and the Democrats are really not going to have to do much work to fend off a Republican challenge.
Who or where is the catalyst for unity in the Republican Party?
Well, that's a good question. Today we are going to hear from William Bennett, who's going to endorse Lamar Alexander, which is an interesting spin on the whole thing. I think Bill Bennett for a long time has been very unhappy with Patrick Buchanan's stance on immigration. Buchanan always talks about wanting to build a, 100-foot wall along the California border. Bill Bennett, Jack Kemp, all the people in Empower America are very are very against closing down our borders and in this whole nativist philosophy that Patrick Buchanan really espouses. Lamar Alexander, I mean, it's not really clear what his ideas are. I mean, I think his main idea to emerge over the past few days has been that he's not negative. I mean, okay, let's move beyond that and go to the next point. So we'll see what happens, but New Hampshire is going to be interesting, and I think Patrick Buchanan's either going to come in first or second.
Former Senator and former presidential candidate George McGovern, good morning. Thanks for being with us.
Pleasure.
What are you reading this morning?
Well, I agree with some of the observations Ms. Ingraham just made. Pat Buchanan is a fascinating character. There's an interesting story on the front page of the New York Times today, which, just to give you the head, says the deficit issue evaporates. You know, I've been kind of aware of that too. The last year or so, around this city at least, here in Washington, the big issue is balancing the budget. I guess everybody from the president on down has made that at least the number one rhetorical issue. And the congressional leadership, both Democrats and Republicans, have put that at the top of the list. But when you get into this presidential competition, the story in the New York Times and others that I've read say that the issue's virtually disappeared. And maybe the reason is that people have discovered when they get out on the hustings that there are a lot more people interested in jobs and what's happening to their families and their buying power and their kids than are interested in the fiscal problems that were so important here in Washington about balancing the budget. Listen to a quote here about Pat Buchanan, who came out a strong second in Iowa. He said, when you get good jobs that put $30 or $40 an hour in people's pockets, you solve the deficit. No one can tell me that the problems of the federal deficit and the loss of these high-paying jobs are unrelated. I think that's true. I think that the decline in the strength of the workers in this country, the growing gap between the workers at the bottom and those at the top, I think that is the issue that a lot of people are concerned about.
This is a great thing. George McGovern and Patrick Buchanan are agreeing on a very, very controversial issue, and this is why the Buchanan candidacy is really going to send this election into a tizzy, because he's appealing to all these, frankly, a lot of Reagan Democrats who are very, very concerned about complete free trade, because at some points free trade, a purist free trade philosophy, conflicts with democratic principles. I mean, when a company downsizes or sends its jobs overseas, an entire town's way of operation will change. Families are destroyed often, and small town America isn't small town America anymore. So there might be some kind of middle ground between these purist free traders who think that there's no, we should absolutely have, our markets should be open regardless of whatever any other country does, and Patrick Buchanan's sort of protectionist stance. But, people like you, George, I think, a lot of Americans out there are very, very concerned with what's happening with our jobs, and Patrick Buchanan's appealing to that, maybe in a bit of a strident way, but he is appealing to that.
Senator, let me just throw one other article in that we looked at earlier, but it's on the same theme. In the Washington Times, President hones appeal to Buchanan's backers. Paul Bedard writes that Pat Buchanan's near victory in the Iowa caucuses has caught the attention of the Clinton administration, which is watching his appeal to blue-collar laborers.
Well, first let me make clear, I think everyone understands this. I'm not a champion of Pat Buchanan. He's happened to be a personal friend of mine, but I don't agree with his answer that all we have to do is throw up the trade barriers. It's a lot more complicated than that. We've got to do a better job on educating uneducated workers, on retraining them. I frankly think that we're not going to resolve the problem of labor in this country without some public service jobs that go beyond what we have now. I don't think the free market alone is going to provide full employment in this country. I don't think it's going to deal with some of the problems we have. What I would like to see, I'm sure Pat Buchanan would raise his eyebrows about this, is some of the Cold War funding that we put into the present military budget. This is a budget that we designed to fight the Sino-Soviet bloc that no longer exists. There isn't any Soviet Union. China is now our most favored nation trading partner. So I'd like to see some carefully planned effort on the part of the Congress and on the part of the executive branch to do what we did after World War II and divert some of these military funds into training and educating people, and also providing jobs in the public sector, rebuilding our roads, our streets, and some of the declining physical infrastructure.
What about all the companies that are trying to go after those federal contracts? I mean, you're basically talking about increasing the size of the federal involvement in people's lives, whether it's creating jobs or what have you. And for good or for bad, the public mood right now is to downsize government and to make it more efficient, make the way the country works more efficient, which is creating another federal program to create jobs, is an anathema to that idea.
Well, do it through the private companies, government contracts, the same way we've done it with the defense industries. I'm not against that. I remember back years ago when I was in the Congress, we had a big debate over the B-1 bomber. And the CEO of the principal company building that bomber came in to talk to me about it. He didn't make the case for the bomber. He made the case for the number of jobs that their company supplied. And I said, well, Mr. Anderson, what if we could give you a contract to build public transit facilities in Southern California? Would you take that? He said, sure. Can you give me the contract? I'd just soon build public transit facilities as to build B-1 bombers. That's what I'm talking about. I don't have any objection at all to diverting some of those things through private industry.
Let me tell our audience that we'll go to your phone calls in about 5 or 6 more minutes. The C-SPAN phone numbers are on the screen, but our lines are quite busy this morning, so if you get a ringing sound, you've made it through, and hold on until we get to your calls. If you get a busy signal, please try again later in the program. What else are you reading this morning?
Well, my old friend Paul Gigot has a very interesting piece about Bob Dole, and he touches on the entire issue that I think is perplexing and concerning a lot of people in the Republican Party. And the question is, does Bob Dole have real electability against President Clinton? Paul Gigot points out the fact that Bob Dole keeps talking about all the ideas he stands for without really articulating them. I mean, his ideas really are the congressional ideas, and they're not really. What is Bob Dole's vision today? Point to 5 things that Bob Dole really believes in passionately. On the one hand, Bob Dole says he's against affirmative action. On the other hand, Bob Dole appointed the Glass Ceiling Commission. Bob Dole is, in so many ways, such an admirable figure, both from our present and from our past, but I think for whatever reason, he's still having difficulty conveying a vision and a sense of real optimism and of hope and growth in the country. And frankly, the reason that Patrick Buchanan is really appealing, obviously, to so many social conservatives is because Bob Dole doesn't. Not that the social conservatives won't support a Bob Dole nomination, but they are concerned that he is really not that pro-life. that he really doesn't take the values issues seriously, and that he's not going to do enough to forward a social conservative agenda. So, you know, Dole for president, maybe. That's what Paul called his article, and it's a big question mark. We'll see. But there's a fight for the soul of the Republican Party right now, and it's either going to be won by, you know, a social conservative or by someone like Bob Dole, who really stands for the status quo in Washington.
Senator, another article from you?
Yeah, there's a front page article in the Washington Post today. Negative ad blitz appears to have backfired on Forbes. Now, obviously, Steve Forbes was not the only one that used negative ads and had negative statements, but the other candidates agreed that he carried it to the nth degree, that a lot of that $15 million he was spending in Iowa and elsewhere was devoted to negative ads aimed at Bob Dole and the other candidates. And I think almost every reporter out there in Iowa detected a reaction against that. It's probably one of the things that really hurt Steve Forbes. I mean, after all, he waged a rather impressive campaign for a while, but I think the last few weeks he turned to a kind of a negativism that really hurt him.
Well, another thing he did was,
and I'm glad to see that. I'm not glad to see the negativism, but I'm glad to see Iowa voters saying, no, we don't want that. We want you to tell us where you stand on the great public issues.
Another thing he did, which really I think hurt him, is he really went after the Christian coalition. I mean, he made several remarks that, you know, they don't really represent all Christians, which I don't think Ralph Reed has ever said he does. But you know, for a candidate like Ralph Reed, for a candidate like Forbes, who already is on shaky ground, I think, with a lot of social conservatives, I don't think it was too politically or strategically smart for him to start taking on the likes of the Christian coalition. He should be figuring out ways to appeal to their values and their beliefs and not alienate them. And when we saw Ralph Reed on This Week with David Brinkley last Sunday, we saw quite an, I think, underneath it all, although he's very poised, a very angry Ralph Reed, and I think that really ended up hurting Steve Forbes.
Senator McGovern, if there is a lesson in negative advertising for Steve Forbes, what's the lesson of Phil Graham's campaign?
Well, Phil never really got that campaign off the ground. There's some people that are just not destined to get to the White House. Maybe I'm one of them, but at least I won the nomination in 1972. I think Phil was never able to really arouse either the conservatives or the moderates in the Republican Party. He just didn't sell. I think he's a very able and intelligent man, but somehow his message didn't come across. Neither did Dick Lugar's, who's one of the most able and experienced candidates in the field. Let me just say one further word about this negativism. The thing I objected to about not only Steve Forbes, but some of the other candidates, is this notion that somehow a candidate like Bob Dole should be condemned because he's had a lot of experience in government. I don't buy that line. I think that that's Dole's strongest point, that he's been the majority leader of the Republicans in the Senate. He's been the minority leader. He's served in the House for a number of years, served in the Senate for a number of years. This isn't an endorsement of him. That would probably hurt him coming from a Democrat.
But I think they're trying to say that, you know, he's trying to run as an outsider. Yeah. It is a little bit ridiculous for him to try to run as an outsider. I mean, experience is one thing, but trying to run as an outside of the Beltway type when you've been here for the last, you know, 27 years is a little tough. I mean,
you can say the same thing about Pat Buchanan. If there's a Beltway creature, it's Pat Buchanan. He's lived in this city most of his life.
Hasn't been getting a government paycheck for most of his life, though, really.
He's worked in the White House for a number of years, and he's worked in the media for a long time. These are not faults, in my opinion. I think they're strengths. I want to see a president who's had some experience. Even a little experience in Washington doesn't hurt.
Let's take our first comment from the audience. Rockville, Maryland. Good morning.
Good morning, Susan. I'm glad to be able to talk to C-SPAN this morning. You had a call earlier from an individual who called in and made some comments, and you did not respond specifically to him.
The caller that made the observation from about the story?
Yes, you don't even have to go into detail about it. If you could just give him a response, because I think anyone watching C-SPAN and gets in deserves some kind of response from you other than thank you for calling.
Well, he made a comment. He didn't ask a question, and what would you like? Why don't you make your point for people that didn't hear it?
I am going to make my point, but I wanted to make that point for the caller who got no response from you. Most people, especially the Republican Party, have probably underestimated the influence of the Christian right. I'd like to hear something from your two panelists as to what they think about the influence of the Christian right and what impact it's going to have now, since we've seen the impact from Iowa. Thank you.
Thanks for your call.
Well, 1 out of every 5 convention delegate will be someone who either supports the goals of the Christian Coalition or is a member of the Christian Coalition. That's 20%. That's pretty staggering. Of course, the Christian right, as it's called, is going to have a huge influence because the Christian right basically believes in the 10 principles that were the Contract of America. Those were the principles of the Christian Coalition. They're not for putting a Bible in every school. They're not for forcing people to go to church. They're not for any of the things that the media likes to say they're for. So, of course, they're going to have a strong influence. And if the Christian Coalition is somehow driven away from whoever the nominee is going to be because they are not sufficiently pro-life, then the Republicans will not win. I mean, that's just a simple fact.
Well, I agree. The Christian Coalition is a potent force inside the Republican Party. It's also a problem for the Republicans because they do go down the line with the 10 points of the Contract for America. I doubt very much if the ultimate nominee of the Republican Party, now it looks like it might be Dole, but whoever, is going to support all 10 points in that contract. It's too extreme. Even with control of the House of Representatives, you can't get that 10-point program passed. You certainly are not going to get it passed in the Senate, where you also have a Republican majority. So I don't think either the Christian Coalition, as it calls itself, which certainly doesn't speak for all Christians. I'm a Christian. They don't speak for me.
Well, neither does the National Organization for Women. I mean, National Organization for Feminists. I mean, that's what they should call it.
None of those organizations.
So let's not single out the Christian Coalition.
No, well, that's I don't single them out, but that's what the question was directed at. There are a lot of parts of that 10-point agenda that I don't think are based on the New Testament, but that's my personal interpretation. I think there are a great many other Americans, including some of the Republican presidential contenders, who are uncomfortable with the Christian Coalition's agenda. I think we saw that in the last election. We'll see it again in '96.
Just a point and follow-up, because I'm sure you're confused about the first comment. We had a call in our first half hour. The gentleman was unhappy about our discussion of a question because we were 3 white people sitting at the table this morning and thought that the issue would have been discussed differently if there had been an African-American at the table. There are 3 white people at the table this morning, but we do have many African-American guests. And try to get a broad representation at the table. Can't happen every morning, but it's something we are interested in, and we know we have a diverse audience out there and like to have diverse viewpoints at the table. So I hope that satisfies our second caller, but that's the topic we were talking about earlier on to end the confusion on that. We have a first voter on the line with us this morning, Nicole Grote. Good morning.
Good morning.
Watching us in Vermilion, Ohio. Where is Vermilion?
Vermilion is on the southern border of Lake Erie in Ohio.
Can you tell me a little bit about your community?
Small community, about 11,000 people. We're very close.
And you are a senior in high school?
Yes, I am.
What's your high school name?
Vermilion High School.
Vermilion High School. How large is it?
About 800 students.
So your graduating class this year will have how many members?
About 200.
What are you going to be doing next year?
I'll be attending Bowling Green State University, Bowling Green, Ohio, to pursue a career in pre-law.
And how did you decide on law as a career?
Through my influences on my teachers and just my general desire to get into law and politics.
You are going to be voting for the first time this year.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about that as you get closer to making your decision?
Right now I feel that I really have to watch the campaign, look at the information that's presented, and then make my decision. As of right now, I have no decision.
Do you know which party appeals to you more?
Right now the Republican Party, but I'm likely to go either way. So.
What are some of the issues that are important to you, Nicole?
Education, the budget.
What specifically about education?
Funding so that students like myself can get loans, grants, etc. from the government so that we can attend college and it doesn't put a huge debt in our pockets.
Now, you also mentioned the deficit. We've been talking at the table this morning about the fact that the deficit seems not to be talked about very much in the presidential campaign. Why do you think it's important?
Eventually, we're going to have to balance the budget and get the deficit out of the way so that we can move on with our government. I think it does. It's going to play a part in this campaign.
Do you expect that you're going to be actively involved in campaigning for your favorite candidate?
Yes.
In what way?
I'm hoping to go out and campaign from door to door, things like that.
When do you expect you'll be making your decision about who to support?
Hopefully soon, but I have no idea, so.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for talking to us, and good luck as you get closer to that polling date.
Okay, thank you.
Appreciate it. Nicole Grote from Vermilion, Ohio. Senator McGovern, one of the things that we've been finding fascinating about this process is learning a little bit about American history from our guests, because I'm always interested after we talk to students about their first vote and who our guests voted for the first time. Do you remember your first presidential vote?
The first presidential election in which I was qualified to vote was '44. I regret to say I didn't even vote. I was a bomber pilot at that time over in Europe. World War II was at its height. There wasn't much of an effort to get servicemen qualified to vote. If I had voted that year, you may be surprised to know this, I was then a Republican. I grew up in a strong Republican family, a conservative Republican family out in South Dakota. And so my mother and father brought me up to think that the Democrats were kind of fearsome people.
Should have listened to your mother and father, George. They're always right.
After the war, I went to Northwestern University on the GI Bill, went all the way through to a PhD at Northwestern, studied American history, and it was during that period that I switched to the Democratic Party. When I came back to South Dakota, we had an old Republican neighbor, Mrs. Truax. She always told my mother that George went bad when he went to that big college in Chicago. Incidentally, Northwestern won the Big Ten football conference this year. But let me just say this. I didn't vote in that election. In '48, I was at Northwestern. I was in school. And I wasn't all that enthusiastic about either Truman or Dewey, who were the candidates. I was like a lot of Americans are now, kind of unhappy with the drift in both parties. We had a candidate on the progressive ticket, the Henry Wallace ticket running. He'd been Secretary of Agriculture. He'd been Vice President of the United States. And I didn't vote for him because he wasn't on the ballot in the state where I lived, but I did do a little work in that campaign. And then the first time I really got around to voting was '52, and I voted for Adlai Stevenson. He lost.
First presidential vote?
1984. I voted for Ronald Reagan, not surprisingly. In 1980, I was a senior in high school, and my most vivid memory of my first election night that I really followed was in my high school cafeteria in Glastonbury, Connecticut. We had like all these tables set up, and I had a class of maybe 420 students, and there was one table for Ronald Reagan, like one very small table. I think there were maybe 6 of us, and the entire cafeteria was filled with supporters of Jimmy Carter, and I was, I think, on the table screaming in delight in November of 1980.
Did you know that the Republican Party was more in line with your thinking? How old were you?
I don't know. At some time in high school, I was always, I think, instinctively conservative because my family was quite conservative, but sort of the law and order issues were important to me, and I thought the Republican stance on values at the time, Ronald Reagan was reinstilling in America a sense of patriotism and optimism that I didn't think the Democratic Party either could offer or did through its leader at the time. But it was really at Dartmouth College that I really began to think hard about these issues at the Dartmouth Review, and that was where I formed sort of stronger and more coherent viewpoints, I think, on the conservative side of things.
Back to Senator.
I was just going to add, to be a little more serious about my days at Northwestern, I really did study American history. As I said, I went all the way through to a doctorate in history and then became an American history prof. Some of my heroes were Republicans. Abraham Lincoln, for example. Theodore Roosevelt was a person I admired. Bob La Follette in Wisconsin. But it seemed to me that looking at American history over the last 100 years, that more often than not, the Democrats came down on the side of what we call the little people. Nobody's really little in America, but working people, farmers, small business people. And I've just been more comfortable the last 40 years as a Democrat, because while that party isn't perfect, I think generally it does speak more for the interests of the ordinary American. That's why I've been a Democrat.
Huntington Beach, California. Good morning. Thanks for waiting.
Good morning, C-SPAN, and good morning, Mr. McGovern.
Good morning.
First of all, I'd just like to make a little comment. Have you ever noticed that every Republican, especially the new freshmen, look and sound like they came out of the same mold? And secondly, I just wanted to comment on the two major parties in general and how they're both in the welfare business. The Democrats are into welfare for the poor, except only 30 cents on the dollar goes to the recipients. The other 70 cents goes in their pockets. The Republicans, on the other hand, give their welfare to the rich corporate business people that help to get them reelected. And I just want to say there is an answer to this problem, and that is to end welfare, both kinds, and vote libertarian and put a libertarian president in office to clean house and give the hardworking middle-class people what they want.
Thank you very much. Laura?
I don't know what really to say about that. It seems like a very disenchanted American citizen. To say that the Republican freshmen are all cut from the same mold, I don't really know what that means. I mean, it's kind of antithetical to think that the debate and the discourse in this country that's being driven by conservatives is somehow conformity. I mean, all great ideas have been debated for the past 200 years in this country, and right now the conservative ideas are the ones who are which are being debated. I mean, when's the last Clinton initiative that was really debated seriously in this country? I can't think of it. Healthcare reform, I guess. So if we're going to talk about what ideas are really motivating people into discussion, you could disagree with the flat tax, but at least we're talking about it.
I do think that there's a general agreement we've got to do something about the welfare system, and we're talking now about welfare primarily for low income or poor people. Most people on welfare are children. The next largest category, I guess, are the young mothers, single parent families. But I still think that there's a group on welfare that we ought to try to get into the workforce. And maybe the only way you can do that is by providing daycare programs, so that if it is a single parent family that the parent can work. Maybe another way is to provide the kind of public service jobs I'm talking about. I'm perfectly happy to have them run through private industry, but I do think there's a crumbling of our entire infrastructure in this country that needs to be rebuilt, and a lot of people who are on welfare ought to be engaged in that kind of work. Now, we talk about the New Deal as a kind of a welfare state. It really wasn't. Roosevelt didn't really believe in putting people on welfare. He put them to work, doing useful things. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration.
Right, but those are all government
they're government programs, Laura, but there's no reason why they couldn't work in concert with private industry, the same way we run contracts for the defense suppliers.
Right, but the difference in the analogy is that the defense contractors were supplying a need that the government, we actually needed. We needed to win the Cold War. We needed to beat down communism. I mean, when you just create a program for the sake of employing people,
I'm talking about
you run into difficulties.
I'm talking about real needs of the country to
why can't private industry fulfill those
private industry is not going to build highways and streets. It's not going to rebuild the central cities.
This is what the American people are going to decide, I think, in this election and in the congressional elections. I mean, in 1994, I think we saw, you can dispute what the elections told us, but I think you saw a general disenchantment at the fact that government was getting too big, too fast, and was not accountable, whether it's in its own books, in its own budget, or the way it conducted itself. And to say we have to create another government program for daycare or roads, or I mean, that's just going down the same road.
I think you missed my point. What I'm talking about is reducing what we're now doing in contracts through the Pentagon to continue this Cold War budget. I'm talking about diverting a modest portion of that into other things that we really need. We don't need a $265 billion.
I think that's a matter of dispute.
Well, it is a matter of dispute, and that's what elections are about. I agree with you. But this election ought to raise those issues.
Right.
We have on the line with us right now David Samuels, who is a contributing editor to Harper's Magazine. The brand new edition of Harper's, the March '96, has one of his pieces with the title Presidential Shrimp. Bob Dole caters the political hors d'oeuvres. Good morning, Mr. Samuels. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
You state definitively in your article, the candidate they select will be these are the Republicans, will be Senator Dole, who, barring recession or the addition of Colin Powell to the ticket, will be defeated by President Clinton in the fall. Just a couple of days after Iowa, are you still so certain about that?
Yes. The reason is that what we're watching now, with all the pageantry of Iowa and New Hampshire, is the third act of a drama whose first two acts took place in Sheraton hotel rooms across America throughout the fall and the winter, out of the eyes of the press, a press that wasn't all too curious about these very, very boring fundraising events to begin with. But you know, I think that what we're looking at also is a case of simple math. More than 70% of the delegates at the Republican convention are going to be elected in 3 weeks in March. Now, to be able to run campaigns in however many states that is, 20-something states, in a 3-week period, you've got to have money on hand. You've got to have, you know, $10 to $15 million ready to spend. You've got to buy TV time. You've got to pay your staff on the ground. You've got to pay for your phone banks and all the other things that make politics run. I think there's one candidate who has that money, who's a credible candidate, and that's Bob Dole. I think that what we may well see is a replay of the 1984 Democratic race, where Lamar Alexander looks very appealing to a lot of people, but simply may not have the money, you know, to run that race. If this primary season were a longer season, it's possible that Lamar Alexander could raise that money. You know, as it stands now, I find it hard to imagine that he will.
Why are you also certain that President Clinton will be the victor?
Because Bob Dole, whatever virtues he may possess as a quote-unquote legislative engineer, in Lamar Alexander's phrase, is, you know, one of the most deadly dull public speakers, you know, that the Republican Party has produced. He is an old man. He stands for nothing. He is incapable of conveying, you know, even the appearance that he believes in the visionary phrases that his speechwriters sometimes write out for him. Watching him read those speeches is a painful experience for his audience, and I'm sure for Mr. Dole as well. And the idea of putting him up against a talented politician like Bill Clinton just seems cruel.
Your story this morning, that we're looking at this morning, is really a description of the industry of running for president and what it takes to raise the money and the influence that that money has on the process. Mm-hmm. One of the things I wanted to ask you, we had a discussion earlier on about the influence of Pat Buchanan on the issues being discussed in this campaign, and how both parties are beginning to talk about populist economic themes. Mm-hmm. You actually discuss populism and economics in your piece. Do you think that it will ever be a legitimate presidential issue again, based on who's giving to campaigns?
No. I think that George McGovern spoke very feelingly about, you know, the kinds of programs that this country needs. There's no question that whatever you believe, America, the American economy, is going through a historic transition right now. It's a transition that's making one class of people much wealthier. I think that if you're smart, well-educated, come from some money, there is no better place, no better time to be born than in America right now. Your opportunities are boundless. If you don't really have skills, if you don't have those opportunities, this is one of the, you know, this is not a good time to be an American. What are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to support your family? Where are you supposed to live? Now, you know, how we're going to deal with that, there are different answers. But we're only getting one answer, whether it's from the Democratic or the Republican Party.
And you're saying that's because of the money system?
Absolutely. Bill Clinton ran in 1992 on what was perceived at the time by the people who voted for him as a populist message. George Bush was unfeeling. He was uncaring. He was signing a bunch of treaties which were going to be to the benefit of rich people, and wasn't taking the kind of steps to take care of middle-class and working-class voters that people wanted. He got into office, and we didn't hear about that stuff anymore. Worker retraining, jobs programs. it disappeared the day that he took office. And I think, what did happen is that he signed NAFTA, he signed GATT, he opposed, on human rights an issue he'd made a lot of in his campaign. He opposed trade sanctions against China. I think that if you want to make sense of that, you have to look at the people who funded the Clinton campaign in 1992, one of whom now sits, Robert Rubin, as Secretary of the Treasury. And so I think when you look across both parties, you see a group of people whose interests are pretty much in common. They are not the interests of working class and middle class Americans. And as long as those people are the people paying for the system, deciding who's going to run, Pat Buchanan can talk all he wants. And, as much as I disagree with him on social issues, it's frankly refreshing to hear someone stand up and say that working people in America aren't having it so good these days.
Mr. Samuels, we haven't much time, but I'm going to ask if you stay on the line for just a second. I'd like to hear each of our guests' response to your thesis, and we'll come back to you for a closing comment. Laura Ingraham?
Not too much of an objective viewpoint from David, but that's not all that surprising. To say that Bob Dole stands for nothing, oh, please. I think he pointed out the clear fact that President Clinton is the person who campaigned as one thing and certainly governed as another. But, in fairness to the president, he moved to the right, frankly, because the country was moving to the right. He tried to reflect more accurately what the country was feeling about government, what it was feeling about how government was affecting their lives, et cetera, et cetera. So, is he turning his back on the liberal constituents of his party? And I probably would count David among those. Absolutely, he sure is. But the problem is what to do about it. Are we going to have more government programs that create more government bureaucracy to so-called, create jobs? Government creating jobs, last time I checked, that didn't work.
Senator McGovern.
First of all, let me say I agree with the basic thrust of David Samuels' analysis. I think he's right on target in what he has to say. I would also agree with Laura that Bill Clinton, after the '92 election, tended to move to the right because he thought that's where the country was. I disagree with that analysis. I don't think that's where the country was. And I think one of the reasons for what is widely reported as a general disappointment in both parties is that voters don't see enough difference between the Democrats, as they're presently moving, and the Republicans. I think that my friend Bill Clinton, the President of the United States, who I will support in 1996, would do better if he staked out a clear progressive position on these issues. I think he ought to have a
I hope he does that too.
Well, I hope he does. And then we'll have an election that will excite the voters, and you won't have the miserable disappointment we had in the voter turnout in Iowa this week, where about a third of the people that were expected to vote didn't think there was enough there to justify going to the polls. But I really believe the American people want a strong health program. I think they want a strong environmental program. I think they want strong support for education. Those are things that Bill Clinton knows a lot about. I just wish he'd stand up a little bit stronger and face up to what is said to be a widespread right-wing drift in the country that I don't think is there.
Mr. Samuels?
If I could, if you have 25 seconds, I'd like to play you a tape of Bob Dole speaking at the event at the Boston Sheraton that I went to, because I think it's the real voice of American politics.
Okay.
Okay, 1 second.
I want to thank Senator Pressler for coming in. I want to just say one word about Senator Pressler. He's running for re-election in '96. He takes money. He takes checks. It's legal in South Dakota to take money out of Massachusetts. So, well, let me tell you something about Senator Pressler. There are probably a lot of people interested in the telecommunications bill in Massachusetts. It's the best thing that we've done all year as far as the future is concerned, technology and jobs. And the chairman of that committee and the one leading the effort right now on a day-to-day basis has been Larry Pressler from South Dakota. Larry, thank you very much.
Now, what you hear there is, a common soundbite, in this sort of unending system that we have where, votes and influence on major legislation is being sold. And there's no one who's been better at that than Bob Dole. And if people want to hear the true voice of American politics, I suggest they listen to that rather than...
Why did you play the Bob Dole tape? Why didn't you play President Clinton campaigning for any of the Democratic candidates across the country?
I think you could do the same thing. I think
What's your answer, though, David? Is it to reform campaign finance laws to make it
I think that until campaign finance laws are reformed, we are not going to see the kind of debate this country deserves on, what are very, very serious issues in a very historic time in the country's history.
So we should get rid of the ban on contributions over $1,000, right?
Excuse me?
Shouldn't we get rid of the ban of the contributions of more than $1,000 then that we currently have in place because of the Supreme Court decision?
Didn't we get rid of the ban?
Yeah, but that's my point. I mean, these people have to scrape and bow for contributions of $1,000 and less. Steve Forbes wouldn't be in the race if we didn't have the campaign finance laws that we do today.
I think the campaign finance laws that we have today are awful. They're hypocritical, and the only thing that could be worse would be allowing people to buy votes outright by making.
But Steve Forbes tried that. He can't do that. I mean,
well, Steve Forbes can't do that because he's, a
But he disproves your point, though. It disproves your point that you can buy your way to the White House.
I'm not saying that you can put someone's horse into the Senate yet, although I think that we're getting closer to that than we have been before. But look, Steve Forbes isn't a credible candidate. He's never been in politics. He's an awful speaker. His positions on issues, like returning to the gold standard, are medieval. But if he were a credible candidate...
I don't think we had a gold standard in medieval times.
Sure they did. The currency was made out of gold.
Mr. Samuels, I'm going to have to say thanks at this point, but I will direct people interested in reading more about what you have to say to the March issue of Harper's Magazine. Thanks for talking to us this morning.
Thank you.
In fact, in the article, although he does focus on Bob Dole, he does use the example of NAFTA and the contributors to President Clinton's campaign. And as he suggested, Senator McGovern says that presidential politics is beholden to the people who can afford to make the $1,000 contributions or get all their friends together to make the $1,000 contributions. The money issue, please.
Well, he's right about that. I think just about everybody that's looked at our present political situation knows that we have to address the campaign financing issue. Too few people contributing money to both sides. I remember a congressman here a few years ago, he said the reason that people are having an increasing difficulty telling the difference between Republicans and Democrats is that we're all feeding at the same trough, meaning all the candidates. Now that's an exaggeration, obviously. Republicans get funding from certain sources, Democrats get from others, but there are too many special interest groups contributing to both sides. What I would like to see is this country adopt a page from some of the democracies in Europe that have been around longer than we have, and they've finally come to the view that you not only have to limit the size of campaign war chests, but you have to primarily fund it with public monies. This would be the cheapest investment taxpayers could make to say we're going to finance these campaigns rather than to let the special interests do it.
The notion that you can buy influence in a presidential election or a senatorial election or a congressional election with a $1,000 contribution is so ridiculous.
Well, I agree. You can't do it
the
with
whole
one
idea that $1,000 or $500 or 50 of your friends getting together, frankly, and making the contribution, which, of course it happens, but the notion of creating another government institution to run elections in this country is something that I think you find European democracies trying to be more like us. I mean, I don't think we have a real crush to be more like they are.
They're not copying
they might have been around for a lot longer, but they're breaking down economic barriers like we've done years ago. So the notion that people are out there buying influence with these paltry contributions. I mean, I would rather have had Jack Kemp run for president. He didn't run because he didn't want to get involved in this $1,000 here, $1,000 there rush to the election. I mean, Steve Forbes would have just given him money and he would have run.
Let me just follow up, though. You talked earlier about the populist group, the workers. Is $1,000 a paltry contribution to someone who's...
I never said it was, but we're talking about influence. We're talking about buying influence. You can make an argument that contributing $10 million to a presidential campaign could be buying influence, but $1,000? $1,000 won't buy you 30 seconds on a local television show.
But if the people that feel like that $1,000 contribution turn out to be 500,000 people, and they all give you $1,000 because you represent their point of view.
But some people say that's their First Amendment right to do so, that they want to be able to spend their money the way they want to. That's their way of expressing themselves.
That's what the First Amendment says. That's why we need to consider some change. One of the reasons that one of the alternatives we might consider is requiring the networks, who after all get that time from us, the air doesn't belong to the networks, to require them to give a certain amount of public service time to candidates, the same amount to the challenger that you give to the incumbent. That's where most of the campaign money goes, to commercial television, to commercial ads on television. And I think you could take a lot of the money out of politics if that part of it were provided as a public service.
Let me go back to a caller. Atlanta, good morning. What's on your mind this morning?
Good morning. How are you? First of all, Susan, let me say that over the last couple of years I've seen you really progress, and just wanted to say how much I've enjoyed watching that progress.
Thank you.
For Laura, she mentioned earlier the election of '92, and she made some point about you can read whatever you want to in the results, but I think
94 I was talking about.
94, I'm sorry. And you can read the results you want, but I think it was only like about 12% of the electorate actually turned out to vote.
Right, but what's the alternative? You know, of course, I mean, we always have historically very low turnouts vis-a-vis the population that is actually able to vote and qualified to vote. But what do you do?
My point is that I think that the big problem, or the big mistake that the Democrats made, was they didn't get out to vote. A lot of Democrats were satisfied with what was happening and wanted to watch President Clinton progress, and from that point just didn't show up at the polls.
Right, but that's a democratic process. If either you get your people out to vote or they're not going to go to the polls. You know, so either your message resonates with them and charges them to drive over or, you know, put their coat on and make the trip to the polls, or they're not going to do it. So you can only translate that, I think, into saying they weren't motivated for whatever reason.
Susan, have we got time for one non-political subject? I saw a story on page 2 in the Washington Post I want to bring up. I'm the former chairman of the Senate Nutrition Committee, and here's an article that says, high-fiber diet lowers heart risk. Now, that ought to interest everybody. We all have hearts. A diet high in fiber from cereal, fruit, and vegetables can significantly lower the risk of heart attacks.
I'm in trouble.
Yeah. Anyway, that's what our committee found about 20 years ago. And by the way, the ranking Republican on that committee was Bob Dole. He and I worked hand in glove for about 10 years trying to draft the school lunch programs, the food stamp programs, and the nutritional guidelines for the American people. This report here comes in the current issue of the American Medical Association Journal. We had the same thing 20 years ago. I'm not boasting, but it is a fact that a diet high in fiber, cereals, fruits and vegetables, and low in fat and cholesterol will make all of us live longer and happier lives. So I just wanted to get that in at a time when politics tends to put new strains on the heart.
Salt Lake City, next caller. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you folks this morning? What an honor to talk to Senator McGovern. I was really angry at him when I came home from Vietnam, but I've healed in that attitude. I think that what you're seeing, and I kind of see a strong silent majority out here scratching its head, wondering if we're not going to have government in our lives, are we going to have government roadblocking our lives? And I think both the Democrats and the Republicans have pretty well shot themselves in the foot. And probably the Republicans have done more to destroy their cause than they have to advance it. Thank you.
Thanks. Response from the table?
I don't know what to say. I mean, if the caller is in the majority, the Republicans are obviously in trouble. I think, again, if the messenger of either party is not clear on his or her viewpoints and his or her message, and I think, Senator McGovern, you made this point about President Clinton, it's actually refreshing to see a real difference between the parties. I mean, the Democratic Party has traditionally been pro-choice. The Republican Party has traditionally been pro-life. Economic issues have really separated the parties before. Today, the American public doesn't really know what the parties think about issues. People are all over the place, and I think it's kind of refreshing pushing if the president sort of stuck to a more liberal agenda. That's really his constituency. That's his base. And the Republicans really put their differences aside and tried to meld together some kind of coalition that makes sense. But I think the caller's saying, we're not really hearing anything consistent. We don't really know what these people believe.
Laura, maybe instead of so much debate about reducing the size of government and reducing the cost and reducing the deficit, we ought to have more debate about what the government should do with the money it has. I think the big issue is budget priorities. What are you going to spend this $1 trillion federal government on? Are we doing enough in education, on the environment, on alcoholism and drugs, which are one of the great curses of this country? What about the poor? Are we really spending too much money on poor people?
Or is the money we're spending working?
Or is it working? Can we do better? I think that's the debate the American people would like to see. I don't think everybody's out here clamoring for a reduction in taxes.
No, but they don't see their money buying anything.
They want to see as you say, they want to see their money used for programs that strengthen their lives, that improve their chances for a better life for their families and themselves. And that's the debate. It shouldn't be how much can we cut taxes, how many people
it has to be historically based. I mean, you have to look at what 30 years of the Great Society has bought us and what we've gotten after 30 years. I mean, that's realistic to see whether our streets are safer, our schools are better, our poor are less poor, whether things really are better off, and we're spending more money than we ever have.
Or maybe the question is, would all of those things been worse if we hadn't have made the Great Society effort? What if we didn't have Head Start? What if we didn't have school lunches? What if we didn't have aid to families with dependent children? I think this society would fall apart without programs like that. I know you don't think that, but that's the kind of issue you and I ought to be debating that, and I think that's what the presidential contenders ought to be debating, and I think you'd get more excitement among the voters if we had that kind of debate, instead of everybody arguing about which one's going to cut our taxes the most and trim the most people out of government jobs. I don't think those are the questions.
Cape Canaveral, Florida. Good morning.
Good morning. I don't find, when I travel around the country working with senior groups, that the people are that far to the right. And by the way, Senator McGovern, I remember you very well for the Senate committee, and I don't find, they're to the right in some areas until you start taking their Medicare and their Social Security away.
Absolutely.
It's really something, but I don't find that the '94 election was any mandate for anything because there weren't enough people out there voting. That's all I had. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That's an interesting point because I agree the '94 election seemed a signal that the country wanted to turn to the right, but you do have to keep that in perspective. More than half the people didn't vote for anybody. Of those who did vote, the Republicans got a small majority, but I'm told that it only represented about 25% of the eligible voters. Now that may be true in some of the other elections in recent years.
Yeah, I'm always amazed by this, though. I'm amazed that when Republicans seem to win, it never is a sign of anything. But when Democrats win, it's always a sea change to the left. Oh, we're really re-examining our progressive ways and our progressive past, and we're really re-embracing those things. But when the Republicans win, and this was same thing was said about Reagan's second victory, and the same thing was said about George Bush's winning. That it really didn't mean what the numbers say it means. It really isn't resonating with the American people. They're not really embracing a conservative agenda. But back in the '60s, when people were taking over university buildings and people were storming the streets, that was really a message of compassion and empathy, and that was really a heartfelt political sentiment among the American people. And today, suddenly, that analysis has changed, and it call me crazy, but it seems to coincide with every time the Republicans win an election, that it really doesn't mean anything.
Caller in here, we're running out of time. Las Vegas, good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I want to comment or make a response to Mr. Samuels and how special interest groups.
Sure.
Okay. President Clinton and the Democratic National Committee and Democratic candidates have been accepting millions of dollars from Native American Indians. Now, that in itself isn't so bad, but you get people like Representative Joe Kennedy of New York telling us that Indian children are starving and Republicans are going to starve them to death. And yet I don't hear of any of the Democratic National Committee giving back any of this money that that Indians have been contributing to them. And when you get President Clinton vetoing an appropriations bill because he said it doesn't have enough welfare in it for Native American Indians, I can't see why taxpayers are subsidizing, like Republicans and independents are subsidizing electing Democratic candidates.
If American Indians are giving millions of dollars to candidates for high office, I'd like to see the evidence of that.
Now, we know that the American Association of Trial Lawyers, however, is one of the biggest contributors to the Democratic Party. And
They're
President Clinton, it doesn't matter, we're talking about special interest. And ATLA, which is one of the biggest influences in Washington right now, is probably single-handedly responsible for defeating tort reform in this country. And I think, Senator, you have some experience with dealing with tort reform problems with your inn in Connecticut.
I'd like to see some tort reform.
And, you know, let's talk fairly here. The Democratic Party has been in the back pocket of ATLA for a long time. And, you know, everyone always talks about the NRA. The NRA is giving all this money to the Republican Party. What people want is they want tort reform. They want this country to run more smoothly and the legal system to be more fair.
Well, I was just picking up on the caller here suggesting that American Indians, with their enormous war chest,
I don't know anything about that.
Well, I think it's generally known the American Indians are perhaps the poorest element economically in our society. They don't have any money to give to any politicians.
Fairfax, Virginia. Good morning.
Good morning. Ms. Ingram, your physical beauty is only exceeded by your mental beauty. I think you're definitely a breath of fresh air, and I hope Susan has y'all more often.
Oh, thank you.
One thing for Senator McGovern. You made a statement that you felt that Democrats were the party for the little people.
Yes.
And, sir, I definitely agree with you. They are the party for the little people, and as long as they stay little, the Democrats are with them. But if they try to climb the ladder of success, the Democrats are going to knock them down every time. Basically, the Democratic Party is the party of slavery. 135 years ago, they were the party of slavery, and that was physical slavery. And there was something to be said for the fact that the slave had a roof over his head, food to eat, and clothes to wear. But that was not freedom, sir. And today we have economic slavery, and as long as people are down, the Democrats stay with them. But if they try to climb up, they knock them down. So I think it's time for freedom in this country.
Thank you.
I guess one of the reasons my dad was a Republican is that he agreed that the Democrats were the party of slavery, and that's true. 125 years ago, that was true. But I don't see the parallel today. The Democrats are not against people rising economically, quite the contrary. Most people have done better, I think, whether they're at the top of the scale, in the middle, or at the bottom. When we've had Democratic administrations,
1976 to 1980, they did better?
It's actually good for business. When working people do well, or when small farmers do well, or small business people do well. I'm not opposed at all to people rising on the income scale. Every American dreams of that, including myself. So the Democratic Party is not against opportunity, but it does believe that the ordinary person, many of them at the lower end of the economic scale, need a special voice here in Washington, and that's what government's all about, as far as I'm concerned. I don't think people like me need a big government to champion my interests, but I think a lot of people who haven't had the advantages I have do need it.
Special thanks to Laura Ingraham and former Senator George McGovern, and to you for participating this morning. I hope you'll all come back, and you as well. We'll be here until 10 o'clock, and at 10 this morning Eastern Time, bring you live coverage of today's session of the Whitewater hearings. Might also tell you that if you are a computer buff, and about 20 minutes from now, we'll be back to the Smithsonian, the National Museum of American History, to tour their computer exhibit. So save up your questions on that, and we'll be back in about 20 minutes for that. But right now, we're going to introduce you to John Rhodes. He served as the minority leader of the U.S. House of Representatives for many years. He's written a book about the experience called I Was There, and you'll hear from him next.
John Rhodes is a former member of Congress and former minority leader in the House. His new book is called John Rhodes, I Was There. Congressman, thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you, Lou. Nice to be with you.
As you sat down to write this book and thought about all those years and all those memories, what memories brought the biggest